Kate Morrison sat alone at her table in the corner of the mess hall eating her lunch when the doors opened and everyone stopped talking at once and the room became completely silent, except for the sound of chairs scraping against the metal floor. The alien princess walked into the room and every human eye turned to stare at her with expressions of anger and hatred on their faces, because the war between humans and the Sylvari Empire had ended only 6 months ago, and too many people had lost family members and friends in the fighting. Princess Lyra stood very tall at nearly 7 feet, with long silver hair that hung down her back like water made of moonlight, and her eyes were purple like the color of distant nebulas, and her skin was pale and smooth like polished marble. On her shoulder sat a small creature that looked like a dragon from old Earth stories, and it had scales that shimmered between red and gold colors, and bright amber eyes that looked around the room with clear intelligence, and the dragon made soft chirping sounds. Lyra moved between the tables with grace that seemed unnatural to human eyes, and she looked for an empty seat where she could sit down and eat her meal. But everywhere she went, the humans turned their backs on her or moved closer together to block the empty spaces. At one table, a young lieutenant named Hayes stood up quickly when Lyra approached, and he said in a hard voice that the seat was taken. Even though everyone could see it was clearly empty, and his jaw was clenched tight with anger. Lyra nodded slowly and moved to another table. But the same thing happened again and again, and Kate watched from her corner as person after person rejected the alien princess and refused to let her sit near them. Kate could see Lyra's shoulders dropping lower with each rejection, and the way her hand moved to touch the small dragon on her shoulder for comfort, and the dragon nuzzled against her neck, making gentle sounds. Kate looked down at her half-eaten meal and thought about her brother Daniel, who had died during the Battle of Europa, when a Sylvari warship fired its weapons and destroyed his vessel and everyone inside it, including her only sibling. She had every reason to hate the princess and her people, and to let Lyra stand there alone and unwanted and rejected by everyone in the room, because that would be fair punishment for all the death and destruction the Sylvari had caused. But something about watching this happen made Kate feel uncomfortable deep in her chest, and it reminded her of times when she was younger and had been the outsider and the one nobody wanted around, and how much that had hurt. Kate remembered being the new kid at the academy and sitting alone in the cafeteria while everyone else had friends and laughed together, and how she had wished just once that someone would make space for her at their table. She thought about Daniel and how he would have handled this situation, and she knew he would have told one of his terrible jokes, and then he would have pulled out a chair, because he always said that holding on to hate never brought anyone back from the dead. Kate cleared her throat, and the sound seemed loud in the quiet mess hall, and she reached over and pulled out the empty chair across from her table, and looked at Lyra, and nodded once toward the chair. The entire mess hall seemed to stop breathing, and everyone turned to stare at Kate with shocked expressions on their faces, and she could feel their eyes burning into her back like laser fire, but she did not look at them. Lyra's purple eyes widened with surprise, and she hesitated for a moment like she was afraid Kate might change her mind, or that this was some kind of cruel trick. But then she started walking slowly toward Kate's table. The alien princess moved carefully like she was walking through a minefield, and when she reached the table, she said, "Thank you," in a soft, musical voice that had a strange accent, and she sat down gently in the offered chair. The small dragon on her shoulder tilted its head and studied Kate with those intelligent amber eyes, and seemed to be deciding whether Kate was dangerous or trustworthy, and after a moment the dragon made a soft, approving chirp. Kate did not say anything else, and just went back to eating her meal and ignored all the angry stares from the other people in the mess hall who clearly thought she was a traitor for showing kindness to someone from the enemy species. Lyra ate her food quietly without trying to start a conversation, and they sat together in silence that was not exactly comfortable but was not hostile either, and it was better than standing alone while everyone rejected you. After the meal ended, Kate stood up and collected her tray and walked away without saying goodbye, and Lyra watched her go with an expression of gratitude mixed with confusion on her elegant alien face. What Kate did not know was that this one simple act of pulling out a chair and making space for someone who was rejected and alone would change the course of history for both humans and Sylvari forever. Over the next 3 weeks, Kate continued to let Lyra sit at her table during meals, and at first they did not talk much, but slowly they began having small conversations about simple things like the quality of the food and the weather simulations on the station. Kate learned that Lyra was not cruel or evil like she had expected an enemy alien to be, but was actually quiet and thoughtful and seemed genuinely interested in learning about human culture and ways of thinking. The small dragon, whose name was Ember, became more comfortable around Kate and would sometimes leave Lyra's shoulder to perch on the edge of the table near Kate's tray and chirp softly like she was asking for attention. Other crew members on the station watched this developing friendship with suspicion and some with open anger, and Kate heard people whispering about her in the corridors and calling her a traitor and a sympathizer behind her back. Lieutenant Hayes confronted Kate one day outside the mess hall and asked her why she was being friendly with the alien who represented the people who had killed millions of humans, including his own wife and young daughter Kate, told him that she was not friends with Lyra, but was simply being civil, and that refusing basic courtesy to someone did not bring back the dead or make the pain go away. And Hayes walked away, shaking his head in disgust. One night when Kate was working late in the observation deck running diagnostic checks on the station systems, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway with Ember on her shoulder. Lyra said she could not sleep because she had too many thoughts in her mind and asked if she could stay there and look at the stars for a while. And Kate shrugged and said it was a free station. They stood together looking out through the massive transparent steel window at the endless expanse of space filled with billions of stars and planets and the cosmic dust that glowed faintly in the darkness. Lyra said that human stars were beautiful and that her people had been watching humanity for many centuries, even before the war began. And Kate felt her muscles tense and her hand moved instinctively toward the weapon at her hip. Kate asked if that meant the Sylvari had been spying on humans all this time, and Lyra said it started as scientific curiosity, but then became something else when the Sylvari leaders began to feel afraid. She explained that humanity spread across the galaxy faster than any other species the Sylvari had ever encountered, and humans adapted to new environments and learned new technologies at a pace that seemed impossible. In just 200 years, humans went from primitive chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel, and in 50 more years, humans had established colonies in 40 different star systems. The Sylvari Emperor and his council began to see humanity as a threat that would eventually surpass the Sylvari Empire in power and influence, and they decided that the only way to prevent this was to attack. First, Kate said bitterly that this sounded like the Sylvari tried to commit genocide because they were scared of competition, and Lyra said, yes, that was exactly what happened and it was wrong, and she had tried to stop it. Lyra told Kate that she stood before the High Council in the Sylvari capital and argued for hours that humans should be approached as potential allies instead of enemies, and she presented research and evidence to support her position. But the council members called her naive and foolish and accused her of being weak and her own father. The emperor gave her an ultimatum that she must either lead military strikes against human colonies or be executed for treason. Kate stared at Lyra and asked what she did, and Lyra's voice became very quiet as she explained that she chose a third option that nobody expected. She sabotaged the Sylvari fleet communication systems just before the massive battle at Saturn, which caused coordination failures across the entire armada and allowed the human forces to achieve a decisive victory. That battle became the turning point in the war and led directly to the peace treaty and the end of hostilities. But it also meant that Lyra was responsible for the deaths of 47,000 Silvery soldiers and crew members, Lyra said she was now a traitor to her own people and unwelcome among humans, and she had nowhere in the entire galaxy where she truly belonged anymore. Kate felt her understanding of the situation shifting as she realized that this alien princess had sacrificed everything, including her home and family, and her place in society, to save humanity from destruction. Before Kate could respond, Ember suddenly launched off Lyra's shoulder and began flying in rapid circles around the observation deck, and then dove toward the window, scratching at the transparent steel with her claws. Kate quickly pulled out her tablet to check the sensor readings, and her eyes went wide as she saw emergency alerts appearing on the screen. And then the entire station shook violently. Alarms began blaring. Through all the corridors, and red emergency lights started flashing, and Kate's tablet showed 27 unidentified vessels dropping out of faster-than-light speed near the station. All the ships had Sylvari energy signatures, and their weapon systems were charging up and preparing to fire, and Kate said this was impossible because there was supposed to be a peace treaty. Lyra's face went pale, and her purple eyes filled with horror as she said that her father had never intended to honor the peace treaty, and he had sent her to this station as bait to locate it. Now the Emperor was here with his fleet to destroy the station and kill everyone on board, including his own daughter, and Kate realized they had walked directly into a trap. Kate grabbed Lyra's arm and started running toward the command center while the station shook again from another impact, and debris began falling from the ceiling panels above them, and sparks flew from damaged electrical systems. They raced through the corridors, passing crew members who were rushing to their battle stations, and some of the humans stared at Lyra with angry, suspicious looks, but there was no time to explain anything. The command center doors slid open, and they burst inside to find Admiral Claire Bennett standing at the central tactical display with her officers gathered around her, looking at the holographic images of the approaching Sylvari fleet. Admiral Bennett was an older woman with gray hair and a weathered face that showed the stress of commanding during wartime, and when she saw Lyra enter her command center, her expression became hard and dangerous. She shouted for Kate to get that alien out of her command center immediately and called for security guards to come and detain the princess right away. 2 armed guards moved forward with their weapons ready, and Ember launched herself off Lyra's shoulder with a piercing screech that made everyone in the room flinch backward, and the small dragon's body suddenly burst into flames. The heat radiating from Ember was intense enough that the guards had to stop approaching, and one of them activated a containment field projector, but the dragon dodged the energy beam and circled protectively around Lyra. Kate stepped between the guards and Lyra and said that the Admiral needed to listen because they did not have much time before the Sylvari fleet started firing and destroyed the entire station. Bennett slammed her fist down on the tactical table and said that this was obviously a trap, and Lyra had led her father's fleet directly to one of humanity's most important orbital installations. Lieutenant Hayes, who was on duty in the command center, said bitterly that they should space the alien princess immediately and be done with it because she represented the species that had murdered his family. Lyra spoke calmly, despite the weapons pointed at her, and said that she did not expect them to trust her, but she could buy them time if they were willing to use her as a tactical asset. She explained that her father wanted to capture her alive because she was valuable as leverage against the few council members in the Sylvari Empire who still opposed his aggressive policies. If Lyra broadcast her location and flew away from the station in a small, fast ship, then the Emperor would split his fleet to pursue her because he could not risk letting her escape. Again, Admiral Bennett crossed her arms and asked what would stop Lyra from simply leading the Sylvari forces to another human installation. Once she left this one, Lyra said she would fly directly into the minefield that humans had secretly placed in Sector 7, and the entire command center went completely silent because that minefield was classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people in the entire human military knew about the existence of that defensive system, and everyone stared at Lyra, wondering how she could possibly have that information. Bennett demanded to know how Lyra learned about something that was beyond top secret, and Lyra said that she had spent the past 6 months since the peace treaty carefully studying every piece of intelligence she could access. She knew her father would eventually come for her, so she had been preparing and gathering information and planning for this exact situation. Kate looked at the tactical display and saw that the Sylvari fleet was getting closer, and their weapons were almost fully charged, and she calculated they had maybe 8 or 9 minutes before the first attack wave. She told Admiral Bennett that they did not have time to debate whether to trust Lyra or not, because if they waited any longer, everyone on the station would die when the Sylvari opened fire. Bennett stared hard at Lyra for several long seconds and then ordered her communications officer to prepare an encrypted directional channel, and she told Lyra that she was getting exactly 1 chance to prove herself. If this turned out to be some kind of elaborate betrayal, then Bennett promised she would personally hunt Lyra down and make sure she suffered for every human life lost. Within minutes, they had Lyra aboard a small courier-class ship that was designed for speed rather than combat, and Ember perched on the control console beside the pilot seat. Kate had insisted on going with Lyra over Bennett's objections, and the Admiral had argued that Kate was throwing away her life for someone who might be leading her into a trap. But Kate said that Lyra had already proven herself by sabotaging her own people during the Battle of Saturn and saving humanity even though it cost her everything. She told Bennett that the least she could do was make sure Lyra did not have to face her father's fleet alone, and Bennett finally agreed but ordered Kate to stay in constant communication. The courier ship launched from the station's flight deck, and Kate immediately pushed the engines to maximum acceleration, while Lyra activated the broadcasting system to transmit her location. Through the view screen, Kate watched as the Sylvari fleet detected the broadcast and hesitated for a moment, as if the commanders were receiving new orders. Then the fleet split into 2 groups with 15 ships continuing their approach toward the station, while 12 ships, including the massive dreadnought at the center of the formation, broke off to pursue the courier. Kate flew the small ship through a dense asteroid field, using the rocks for cover and weaving between them at dangerous speeds, while energy beams from the pursuing Sylvari vessels lit up the darkness around them. One beam came so close that Kate had to throw the ship into a spinning barrel roll, and she heard the hull plating groan from the stress, and alarms started beeping to warn about structural damage. Lyra worked at the navigation console, plotting the fastest course to Sector 7 while also monitoring the pursuing ships. And she said they were gaining quickly because the dreadnought was faster than she expected. Kate gritted her teeth and pushed the engines even harder until the temperature warnings turned red, and she knew they were risking a catastrophic failure. But they had no choice except to keep running. Behind them, the Sylvari dreadnought fired its main weapon, and a massive beam of concentrated energy stabbed through space toward their ship. Kate saw it coming on her sensors and yanked the controls hard to the left, sending them into a spiral that barely avoided the beam, and she felt the heat wash over the hull as it passed. She shouted that the Sylvari were not trying to disable their ship, but were shooting to kill. And Lyra said quietly that her father had other children, and she was expendable to him now. Ember, who had been sitting calmly on the console, suddenly started shrieking, and her body began to glow brighter and brighter until the temperature inside the cockpit started rising rapidly. Kate asked what was happening to the Dragon while struggling to keep the ship steady as more weapons fire streaked past them from multiple directions. Lyra said with strain in her voice that Ember was responding to her emotions because dragons share a deep bond with their chosen riders that goes beyond what human science can explain. The dragon could feel everything Lyra felt, including her fear and rage and desperation, and if Lyra could not calm Ember down, then the dragon would transform into her true form. Before Kate could ask what that meant, Ember's body suddenly expanded in an explosion of flame and light that shattered the cockpit canopy and should have killed them both. But instead of dying in the vacuum of space, Kate found herself surrounded by warmth and protection because Ember had grown enormous with wings that stretched 50 feet from tip to tip. The dragon's body now completely surrounded and shielded the damaged courier ship from the vacuum, and her scales, which had been red and gold, were now blazing like molten metal. Ember opened her massive jaws and roared with a sound that Kate felt in her bones and in her soul, and then the dragon unleashed a torrent of white-hot flame toward the pursuing silvery vessels. Kate watched in awe through the broken canopy as the dragon fire washed over two of the smaller ships, and their shields collapsed under the ancient power, and the vessels began breaking apart. Lyra's eyes were glowing the same red color as her dragon, and she said in a voice that sounded both near and far away that this was Ember's true form. The small shape was what the dragon chose for comfort and companionship. But in battle she became something ancient and terrible and filled with the fury of her kind. The Sylvari dreadnought continued advancing and fired everything it had at once, creating a barrage of energy beams and missiles that filled the space between them. Ember tried to block the attack, but there was too much incoming fire, and several beams got through her defenses and burned across her scales, and the dragon screamed in pain. Kate could see the dragon was wounded and bleeding streams of liquid fire into the void, but Ember kept flying and kept protecting them, even as more weapons struck her. Body. Kate checked their position and saw they were still several thousand kilometers from the minefield, and at their current speed they would not reach it before the dreadnought destroyed them. Lyra's hands flew across her console with desperate speed, and she said they would make it, and told Kate to hold on tight because she was sending the coordinates directly to Ember through their mental bond. The dragon folded her massive wings tight against her body and dove straight down, relative to the plane of battle, accelerating at a rate that should have been impossible. The courier ship groaned and shrieked as Ember carried them faster and faster with the Sylvari fleet, following close behind, convinced they had their prey cornered. Kate's sensors showed them entering Sector 7, and she triggered the activation signal for the gravitational mines that had been hidden throughout this region of space. The first mine activated and created a sudden spike of crushing artificial gravity that caught 3 Sylvari ships and pulled them together like a giant invisible hand, crushing them into twisted wreckage. Then another mine activated and the void lit up with explosions as ship after ship flew into the trap that the Sylvari fleet had not known existed. But the dreadnought commander was experienced and cautious, and Kate saw the massive ship beginning to slow down and pull back with its shields at maximum strength. Kate shouted that the dreadnought was going to escape, and if it did, then the captain would report the minefield location back to Sylvari Command, and humanity would lose this strategic advantage. Lyra looked at Kate, and there was something in her purple eyes that made Kate's heart sink. Because she recognized the expression of someone who had made a final decision, Lyra said softly that the captain would not escape if he thought the trap had been destroyed, and Kate started to ask what she meant. But Lyra had already closed her eyes. Ember roared again and released the courier ship from her claws and turned back toward the advancing dreadnought, despite her wounds and the fire bleeding from her damaged scales. Kate screamed for Lyra to stop and not do this because it would kill her, but Lyra's voice came through the communication system, sounding distant and at peace. She told Kate to inform Admiral Bennett about the exact coordinates of the minefield and to tell her there were 17 more hidden Sylvari fleet positions in the data files, and most importantly to tell Bennett that not all Sylvari were monsters. Then Ember flew straight at the dreadnought's bridge with her wings spread wide and her body glowing brighter than a star, and she crashed into the command section. The dragon's body erupted in a massive explosion that consumed the entire front half of the dreadnought from the inside, and the blast was so bright that Kate had to shield her eyes. When she could see again, there was nothing left but an expanding debris field. and Kate felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the princess was gone. Kate slammed her fists against the control panel of the drifting courier ship and screamed in rage and grief as she stared at the expanding cloud of debris where the dreadnought had been destroyed along with Lyra and Ember. She felt hot tears running down her cheeks, and her chest hurt like someone had reached inside and torn out her heart because she had just watched someone sacrifice themselves to save others. The remaining Sylvari ships were retreating now that their command vessel was destroyed and their formation was broken and scattered. But Kate barely noticed because all she could think about was the alien princess who had given up everything. She thought about how Lyra had been rejected by everyone in the mess hall and how Kate had simply pulled out a chair and made space, and that one small act of kindness had led to this moment. Kate activated the communication system to report back to Admiral Bennett and tell her that Lyra was gone and the mission had succeeded, but the words caught in her throat. Then something impossible happened, and Kate's sensors detected movement in the debris field, and she looked up with wide eyes, not daring to hope. Through the flames and wreckage, a shape emerged, flying weakly and unsteadily, and it was Ember, but much smaller now, barely larger than she had been before, and clutched in her claws was a single figure. Lyra was unconscious, and her silver hair was burned black in places, and her elegant armor was cracked and scorched and bleeding, but her chest was moving up and down with shallow breaths. Kate immediately engaged the emergency protocols and extended magnetic grappling clamps to carefully pull Ember and Lyra into the courier ship's cargo bay. The dragon collapsed onto the floor the moment she was inside, and her scales were dull and cracked, and she was breathing heavily with obvious pain, but her amber eyes were still alert. Kate rushed back to the cargo bay and knelt beside Lyra, checking for vital signs, and she found a pulse that was weak but steady, and she carefully moved the princess to the medical pod. She activated the pod's emergency systems, and it began scanning Lyra's injuries and administering treatment, and Kate stood there watching the readouts and praying to whatever gods might listen that Lyra would survive. Ember crawled over to the medical pod and pressed her head against the transparent cover and made soft whimpering sounds, and Kate realized the dragon was crying for her rider. Kate reached out slowly and touched Ember's head, and the dragon did not pull away, but instead leaned into the touch, seeking comfort from another living being. She stayed there with her hand on the dragon's warm scales while the medical pod worked and the courier ship drifted through space, and eventually Kate activated the engines and set course back to the station. The journey took several hours, and Kate spent most of that time sitting beside the medical pod talking to Lyra, even though the princess could not hear her. She told Lyra about her brother Daniel and how he used to make terrible jokes and how he would have liked meeting someone brave enough to stand against their own father to do what was right. When they finally arrived at the station, Admiral Bennett herself was waiting at the flight deck with a full medical team, and they rushed Lyra to the main medical bay while Kate gave her report. Bennett listened to everything, and when Kate finished, the Admiral was quiet for a long moment before saying that Lyra had provided intelligence that allowed humanity to strike back at multiple Sylvari positions. The coordinated attacks had been successful and had crippled nearly a third of the Emperor's remaining military capability in a single day. But Bennett's expression was grave as she explained that the Emperor had made a galaxy-wide broadcast declaring Lyra an enemy of the Sylvari Empire with a massive bounty on her head. More than that, he had threatened to resume the war in full force unless Lyra was returned to him for public execution, as an example to anyone else who might consider betraying the Empire. Kate felt anger burning in her chest, and she said they should never give Lyra back to her father, and Bennett agreed, but explained that the situation was more complicated than simple defiance. The human government was divided on whether continuing to protect Lyra was worth risking a return to full-scale war, and some politicians were arguing that one alien life was not worth millions of human lives. Kate spent the next 4 days sitting beside Lyra's bed in the medical bay, while the princess remained unconscious and the doctors said her injuries were severe, but she would likely survive. Ember stayed in a special containment room that had been designed for her with soft padding and temperature controls, and the dragon refused to eat or drink anything and just sat staring at the wall. On the 5th day, Kate was reading reports on her tablet when she heard movement from the bed and looked up to see Lyra's purple eyes slowly opening. Lyra looked around the medical bay with confusion on her face, and then her eyes found Kate, and she tried to speak, but her throat was too dry and damaged. Kate quickly got her some water and helped her drink, and after a few moments, Lyra's voice came out as a hoarse whisper asking what happened. Kate explained that Ember had somehow survived the explosion and had saved Lyra by wrapping her body around the princess and shielding her from the worst of the blast. Dragons were apparently far more resilient than anyone had realized, and Ember was already healing. Though she was still weak and in pain, Lyra closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, and she whispered that her dragon had saved her life again, just like she had done so many times before. Then Kate told Lyra about the Emperor's broadcast and the bounty and the threat to restart the war, and she watched as Lyra's expression became heavy with guilt. Lyra said quietly that Kate should return her to her father and not let her failure cause another war that would kill millions more people on both sides. Kate stood up abruptly and said that Lyra's sacrifice had saved the station and provided intelligence that had already prevented future attacks, and that was the opposite of failure. But Lyra shook her head and said that Kate did not understand, because her father was not the real threat and never had been. She explained that the Emperor had been in contact with something ancient that existed in the void beyond all charted space, and this entity was manipulating both humans and Sylvari. Lyra said she had seen forbidden texts in the deepest archives of her people that told of creatures called the Devourers, who moved between galaxies consuming advanced civilizations. These beings had arrived in their galaxy and had begun sending messages to Lyra's father, giving him instructions and orders, and making him believe they were gods. The Emperor thought that if he eliminated humanity, as the Devourers commanded, then they would spare the Sylvari and make them servants, but Lyra knew this was a lie. Once humanity was destroyed, the Devourers would consume the Sylvari as well, because that was what they always did. According to the ancient records, Kate sat back down slowly and asked if Lyra had any proof of these claims, because it sounded like something from a science fiction story. Lyra pointed to a small data device that had been in her armor when the medical team removed it, and she said everything she had managed to compile was stored in that device. Kate picked up the device and connected it to her tablet and began reading through intercepted transmissions and archaeological evidence and recordings that Lyra had made secretly. The more she read, the more her blood ran cold, because if this information was accurate, then both humans and Sylvari were in far greater danger than anyone had imagined. She asked Lyra what they should do, and Lyra said they needed to travel to the heart of Sylvari space to the Imperial Archives where the ancient records were kept. There was information there about how previous civilizations had fought against the Devourers and survived, and if they could access those records, they might find a way to save both species. Kate said that was insane, because the moment Lyra entered Sylvari space, every ship and soldier would be hunting for her to collect the bounty. Lyra nodded and said that was why she needed someone she trusted to go with her, and she looked at Kate with hope and desperation in her purple eyes. Before Kate could respond, Admiral Bennett walked into the medical bay and said she had been listening to their conversation through the room's monitoring system. Bennett said that she had reviewed the intelligence Lyra provided and had multiple expert teams analyze it, and either this was the most elaborate deception in history or they were all in serious trouble. Lyra said quietly that it was the latter, and Bennett nodded slowly and then explained what was going to happen next. Officially, Lyra had died in the explosion with her dragon, and Kate had witnessed it happen, and there would be memorial services and diplomatic messages sent to the Empire. Unofficially, Kate and Lyra were going to steal one of humanity's fastest reconnaissance ships and disappear into Silveri space to find the truth. Bennett pulled out a data chip and tossed it to Kate, explaining these were codes for deep cover agents that humans had embedded in the Empire since before the war. Kate caught the chip and stared at Bennett in shock and asked if the Admiral was really authorizing this mission. Bennett said she was not authorizing anything, and officially Kate had gone rogue and stolen military property and deserted her post. But off the record, Bennett had lost her entire family to the Silvari attack on New London, and if there was even a chance they had been fighting the wrong enemy, then she needed to know. She asked Kate why she thought Kate was the right person for this impossible mission, and Kate said because she was the only person who had looked past the uniform and species to see the person underneath. Bennett told Lyra that if this was a betrayal or elaborate trap, then she would personally hunt Lyra across the galaxy and end her. But Lyra said she understood and accepted those terms. After Bennett left Kate and Lyra sat in silence for several minutes, just processing what had just happened and what they were about to attempt, Kate finally said that this plan was completely insane, and they would be flying into enemy territory to sneak into the most heavily guarded location in the Empire to steal ancient records about galaxy-eating monsters. Lyra smiled weakly and said that when Kate put it that way, it did sound rather impossible, but Kate extended her hand and asked if they were partners. Lyra took her hand and gripped it firmly, despite her injuries, and said yes, they were partners, and they would face this together. In the containment room nearby, Ember lifted her head and made a low rumbling sound that seemed like approval, and Kate knew the dragon understood what was happening. Whatever ancient horror waited for them in the darkness between stars, they would face it together as human and Silvari as commander and princess, as two people who had made space for each other. When the universe demanded they stay enemies, Kate thought about her brother Daniel and how he would probably make a joke about her going on a suicide mission with an alien princess and a dragon, but he would also tell her he was proud. She looked at Lyra and saw the same determination in those purple eyes that she felt in her own heart, and she knew that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really do change everything. They had 3 weeks to prepare before they would steal the reconnaissance ship and begin their journey into the heart of the Silvari Empire, and Kate intended to use every moment wisely, because if they failed, then both species would be consumed by something far worse than war and the galaxy would fall into darkness. 3 weeks passed, and Kate stood in the flight bay beside the reconnaissance ship she had nicknamed Defiant, while the final preparations were being made for their dangerous journey into Silvery space. Lyra had recovered enough to walk and move normally, though she still had scars on her arms and face from the explosion, and her silver hair had been cut shorter where it had been burned. Ember was also healing well and had returned to her smaller form and sat on Lyra's shoulder, making soft chirping sounds and watching everything with her intelligent amber eyes. Admiral Bennett came to see them off, and she handed Kate a small emergency beacon and told her to activate it only if there was absolutely no other choice, because any rescue attempt would likely start another war. Kate took the beacon and promised to bring Lyra back alive, and Bennett said she was counting on it because the fate of two species might depend on what they discovered. The Defiant launched from the station, and Kate engaged the stealth systems using special codes that would mask their energy signature and make them appear to be nothing more than space debris. They flew through the outer territories, carefully avoiding patrol routes that Kate had memorized from intelligence reports, and Lyra provided guidance about Silvari detection systems. During the journey, Lyra taught Kate basic words and phrases in the Silvari language and explained cultural customs that might be important if they needed to interact with her people. Kate was surprised to learn that Silvari society valued honor and artistic expression almost as much as military strength, and that most Silvari had opposed the war but were too afraid to speak against the emperor. They talked about their childhoods, and Kate told stories about growing up on Earth with her brother Daniel and all the trouble they got into as kids. Lyra described life in the Imperial Palace and how lonely it had been despite being surrounded by servants and guards. Because everyone treated her as a symbol rather than a person, Ember seemed to enjoy these conversations and would chirp or trill at certain parts like she was adding her own commentary. After 2 weeks of careful travel, they approached the outer markers of silvery space, and Kate felt her heart racing because they were now entering territory where discovery meant certain death. The silvery homeworld of Silverus Prime appeared on their sensors, and Kate stared at the beautiful planet covered in silver forests that gave the world its name. Lyra explained that the Imperial archives were built into the roots of the World Tree, which was a massive living structure that had been grown over thousands of years. The outer levels of the archives were accessible to scholars, but what they needed was in the Forbidden Vault 10,000 feet below the surface, protected by both technology and ancient magic. Kate asked what magic meant, and Lyra said it was what humans would call psionic defenses that could read a person's thoughts and intentions. Only members of the royal bloodline could pass through the deeper wards, and anyone with hostile thoughts toward the Empire would trigger alarms. Kate realized this meant she could not go into the vault with Lyra because she had plenty of anger and resentment toward the Silvari for killing her brother, and so many others. Lyra said she had been trying to find a way to let that anger go, but Kate touched her arm and said it was not about letting go, but about understanding why they were really here. She told Lyra about how Daniel used to say that holding on to hate never brought anyone back, and the only way forward was through understanding and forgiveness. Kate said she was not doing this for revenge against the Silvari, but to prevent more brothers and sisters from dying on both sides, and that made her intentions pure enough. They landed in a remote forest, clearing far from any settlements, and Ember immediately took flight to scout the area, while Kate and Lyra gathered their equipment. The silver forest around them was breathtaking, with trees that sang as the wind passed through their leaves, creating harmonies that seemed almost alive. Kate saw strange creatures moving through the shadows that looked like combinations of animals from Earth, but with glowing features, and she realized how alien this world truly was. They traveled on foot for nearly a day, moving carefully through the forest and hiding whenever Ember warned them of patrols nearby. As they got closer to the archives, Kate could see the World Tree rising above the forest canopy, and it was so massive that it seemed impossible. The trunk was easily a mile wide, and its branches spread across the sky like a wooden continent, and carved into the base was an entrance of incredible beauty. Lyra pointed to a small opening hidden in the roots, and explained this was a service entrance used by maintenance workers that would take them directly to the lower levels. They crawled through the narrow passage with Ember flying ahead to scout, and Kate felt her claustrophobia threatening to overwhelm her, but she focused on moving forward. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast chamber lit by bioluminescent fungi growing on the walls, and at the center was a door carved from a single piece of crystal. Lyra said this was the entrance to the Forbidden Vault, and as they approached, Kate felt a strange tingling sensation wash over her, like something was probing her mind. She thought about Daniel and his terrible jokes, and the moment in the mess hall when she made space for Lyra, and all the reasons she had come on this journey. The crystal door began to glow with psionic energy, and then it swung open, and Lyra stared at Kate in amazement, saying that Kate's heart was pure enough to pass. The wards inside the vault was nothing like Kate expected, because instead of books, there were crystalline structures everywhere pulsing with stored information. Lyra explained these were memory crystals that contained knowledge recorded directly from the minds of ancient beings, and each one held more data than entire libraries. They searched through hundreds of crystals, looking for one marked with a specific symbol that represented the Devourers in the old language. Ember helped by using her keen eyes to spot patterns the others missed. And finally the dragon chirped urgently, while perched on top of a crystal, pulsing with dark purple light. Lyra reached for the crystal, and the moment her fingers touched it, the entire vault erupted with brilliant light, and images flooded the space around them. Kate saw visions of ancient civilizations that spanned thousands of worlds with technology and culture far beyond anything humans or Sylvari had achieved. Then she saw them arrive, and the Devourers were not ships or armies, but darkness itself, like voids in reality that consumed everything they touched. They moved between galaxies like parasites, drawn to the energy signatures that advanced civilizations produced, and wherever they went, they left only emptiness. The visions showed how previous civilizations had fought back with united alliances and weapons that tore holes in space-time itself, and some survived, but most did not. Then came a final warning that the Devourers always sent heralds first to infiltrate civilizations and sow discord and turn species against each other before the harvest. Kate understood with horror that the Silvery Emperor had been manipulated for years or decades to wage war against humanity and weaken both sides. Lyra translated information from the crystal saying they had maybe 3 or 4 months before the Devourers arrived in force to consume both species. Behind them, a voice spoke in perfect Silvery, and Kate spun around to see 20 armed guards flooding into the vault with their weapons aimed directly at her and Lyra. Leading them was an older Sylvari male who looked like Lyra but with cold eyes that seemed wrong, like there was something alien looking out from behind them. This was the Emperor and Lyra's father, and he said he had been waiting for them to come here because the herald saw everything and knew Lyra would try to warn others. He said that Kate was stupid for showing compassion to an enemy, and that weakness would be her death, and the guards moved forward to capture them. Ember launched herself at the Emperor, but one of the guards fired a containment field that trapped the dragon in midair, and she shrieked in fury while her body blazed with heat. Lyra shouted for Kate to run, but more guards were blocking the exit, and Kate raised her weapon, knowing it was useless against so many enemies. Then something unexpected happened, and the memory crystal in Lyra's hand pulsed with brilliant energy, and an ancient voice echoed through the vault. The voice said they had been judged worthy and should take what they learned and flee to warn their peoples and unite them, because only together could they hope to survive. All the memory crystals in the vault suddenly shattered at once, releasing centuries of stored energy in a devastating explosion of light and force. Guards went flying in all directions, and their weapons shorted out and sparked, and the containment field holding Ember collapsed and freed the dragon. Ember immediately grew to her massive form, and her body filled half the chamber, and she roared with fury, and Kate grabbed Lyra's hand, and they ran. The Emperor was screaming behind them, but his voice no longer sounded silvery or even human, but something ancient and terrible and alien. He shouted that they could not stop what was coming, and that all would be consumed and the Devourers were inevitable. Ember smashed through levels of the archives using her massive body to clear a path, and she scooped Kate and Lyra up in her claws and launched toward the surface. Alarms were blaring throughout the entire complex, and Kate could see ships lifting off from the Imperial Palace in the distance, and she knew they had only minutes. The Defiant was waiting where they left it, with engines already warming because Kate had programmed it for autonomous standby, and they climbed aboard quickly. Ember shrank back to her smaller size to fit through the airlock, and Kate threw herself into the pilot seat and engaged the engines at maximum power. Lyra shouted for Kate to get them out immediately, and Kate activated the faster-than-light drive before they had even cleared the atmosphere. It was incredibly dangerous and possibly suicidal to jump to FTL while still in a gravity well, but waiting would guarantee their death. Reality twisted and bent around them as they jumped away from Sylvaris Prime, leaving the Emperor and his guards far behind. For a long moment nobody spoke, and they just sat there breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened. Kate finally said, They had gotten the proof and the warning and everything they needed to convince both species of the real threat. Lyra said that now the entire empire knew she was alive and working with humans, and her father would use this as justification to resume the war. Kate said no, because they had exposed the real enemy, and now they just needed to make sure both humans and Sylvari heard the truth before it was too late. There was one place where representatives from both species met on neutral ground, and that was a Accord station where the peace treaty had been signed. Lyra said that station was heavily monitored, and the moment they arrived, they would be arrested by both sides. Kate set the coordinates and said it was a long shot, but it was the only way to get both species in the same room long enough to show them the evidence. Lyra looked at Kate and felt something warm in her chest that was deeper than friendship, and it was the kind of trust that transcends species and history. She placed her hand over Kate's on the controls and said they should take that shot together. The Defiant raced through the void carrying two unlikely allies and one dragon, and the desperate hope that they could somehow save both their species from annihilation. Behind them, in the depths of uncharted space, something ancient stirred and waited with patient hunger, because the Devourers had existed for millions of years. They could wait a few months longer until both humans and Sylvari were weak enough, and divided enough, and ready to be harvested. But what the ancient darkness did not understand was that sometimes in the darkest moments, the most unexpected alliances form from simple acts of kindness, and sometimes making space for another person can spark a revolution that changes the fate of galaxies. The Defiant emerged from faster-than-light travel near Accord Station, and Kate immediately activated every stealth system they had because sensors would be scanning for them within seconds. Accord Station was a massive structure floating in neutral space between human and Sylvari territories, and it had been built specifically for diplomatic meetings after the war ended. The station was shaped like a ring, with two distinct sections connected by a central hub, and one side housed human delegates, while the other side housed Sylvari representatives. Kate knew that both sides maintained heavy security presence, and the moment they were detected, every weapon on the station would be pointed at them. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, studying the station layout on her display and trying to figure out how they could possibly get inside without being killed immediately. Ember perched on the console between them and made soft, worried chirping sounds because the dragon could sense the tension and danger in the situation. Kate said they needed to broadcast their message on all frequencies so that everyone on the station would hear it at the same time before security could shut them down. Lyra agreed and began preparing the data package with all the evidence they had collected, including the memory crystal recordings and the intercepted transmissions from the Devourers. They moved closer to the station, staying just outside weapons range, and Kate opened a communication channel that would reach every receiver on Accord Station. Her voice was steady as she identified herself as Commander Kate Morrison of the human fleet and announced that she had urgent information that both species needed to hear. Within seconds, responses came flooding back, and some were human officers demanding she surrender immediately, while others were Sylvari commanders threatening to destroy her ship. Admiral Bennett's voice cut through the chaos, and she demanded to know what Kate thought she was doing. By bringing a wanted fugitive to a diplomatic station, Kate took a deep breath and said that everything both species believed about the war was wrong and they had been manipulated by an outside force. She began transmitting the data package and asked everyone to please look at the evidence before making any decisions about attacking or arresting them. For several long moments, there was silence as people on both sides reviewed the information, and Kate watched her sensors showing multiple weapon systems locking onto their position. Then Admiral Bennett's voice came back, and it was quieter and more serious, and she said that Kate needed to dock immediately and present this information in person. A Sylvari voice also responded, and Kate recognized it as Commander Saren, who led the Sylvari delegation, and he said that if this was a human trick, then Kate and Lyra would both be executed. Kate guided the Defiant toward the docking bay, and she could feel her hands shaking slightly on the controls because they were putting themselves completely at the mercy of both sides. Lyra reached over and squeezed Kate's hand, and said that no matter what happened, she was grateful that Kate had made space for her that day in the mess hall. They docked, and the airlock opened, and Kate was not surprised to see armed guards from both species waiting for them, with weapons drawn. Admiral Bennett stood at the front of the human group and Commander Saren led the Sylvari delegation, and both looked extremely angry. Kate and Lyra stepped out slowly with their hands visible, and Ember stayed on Lyra's shoulder, but her scales were glowing slightly with readiness to defend her rider. Bennett said that Kate had committed desertion and theft of military property and would face court-martial, and Saren said that Lyra was a traitor with a bounty and would be returned to the Emperor for judgment. Kate said firmly that they could arrest her and execute Lyra after they listened to what they had discovered, but if they did not act quickly, then both species would be extinct within months. She asked them to gather all the senior delegates from both sides in the main conference room and give them 1 hour to present their case. Bennett and Saren looked at each other, and some unspoken communication passed between them, and finally Bennett nodded and said they would get 1 hour. The conference room was large and circular, with seats arranged so that humans sat on one side and Sylvari sat on the other, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Kate stood at the center with Lyra beside her and began presenting the evidence they had gathered, starting with the intercepted transmissions that Lyra had recorded secretly. She showed them the memory crystal recordings of ancient civilizations being consumed by the Devourers and explained how these entities moved between galaxies. Lyra spoke about the forbidden texts in the Imperial archives that warned of the heralds who infiltrated species and turned them against each other. She explained how her father, the Emperor, had been receiving messages from deep space for years, and how his personality had slowly changed as he became obsessed with destroying humanity. A human delegate interrupted and said this sounded like fantasy, and asked why they should believe any of it. Kate pulled up the astronomical data they had collected and showed unusual energy signatures detected in deep space that matched the descriptions from the ancient records. A Sylvari counselor stood and said that even if this threat was real, it did not change the fact that humans and Sylvari had killed each other for years and trust was impossible. Lyra stepped forward, and her voice was strong, as she said that she had betrayed her own father and her empire because she believed the war was wrong. She had sacrificed everything, including her home and family and nearly her life, to try to save both species because she understood they were stronger together. Kate added that her brother had died in the war and she had every reason to hate the Sylvari, but she chose to make space for understanding instead of holding on to hatred. She said that Daniel used to tell her that the only way forward was through forgiveness and cooperation, and she believed he was right. Admiral Bennett stood and said that the human government had been analyzing the data Kate transmitted, and their scientists had confirmed the energy signatures were real. Commander Saren also stood and said that Sylvari intelligence had detected similar anomalies and had been unable to explain them until now. A younger human officer asked what they were supposed to do, because if the Devourers were as powerful as the records suggested, then how could anyone fight them? Lyra said that the ancient records showed that some civilizations had survived by uniting their resources and technology and fighting together. No single species could defeat the Devourers alone, but multiple species working in coordination had managed to drive them back. Kate said they needed to establish a joint military command immediately and begin sharing technology and intelligence and preparing defensive positions. Many delegates began shouting objections and saying this was impossible and that their peoples would never accept cooperation with former enemies. Then something unexpected happened, and Ember flew from Lyra's shoulder to the center of the room and grew larger until she was the size of a large dog. The dragon's scales began glowing with different colors, and she opened her mouth, and instead of fire, a holographic image projected into the air above her. The image showed the Devourers approaching their galaxy, and it was based on the trajectory data from the astronomical readings. Everyone in the room went silent as they watched the simulation of darkness spreading across star systems and consuming everything in its path. The timeline showed they had approximately 3 months before the first Devourer vessels reached the outer colonies of both human and silvery space Ember, shrunk back to her normal size, and returned to Lyra, and the room remained completely silent as everyone processed what they had just seen. Finally, an older silvery counselor stood and said that his grandfather had told him stories about the ancient warnings, but he had thought they were myths. He looked at Lyra and said that if the Emperor's own daughter was willing to sacrifice everything to warn them, then perhaps they should listen. A human general stood and said that she had lost her sons in the war, but she did not want to lose her grandchildren to something worse. She said that maybe it was time to put aside old grievances and face the real enemy together. Admiral Bennett called for a vote among the human delegates on whether to establish a joint defense initiative with the Silvari commander. Saren did the same for the Silvari delegation. Kate held her breath as hands were raised and votes were counted, and when the results came back, both sides had voted in favor. Though it was not unanimous, Bennett said that this was unprecedented and there would be massive political opposition on both sides, but they would move forward. She looked at Kate and said that the charges of desertion would be dropped and Kate would be given command of the Joint Reconnaissance Division. Saren looked at Lyra and said that while he could not speak for the Emperor, he personally believed Lyra was a hero and not a traitor. He said that any Silvari who wished to join the defense initiative would be welcome and protected from the Emperor's reach. Over the next several weeks, Kate and Lyra worked around the clock helping to coordinate the joint defense preparations. Human and Silvari engineers began sharing technology and developing new weapons based on the information from the ancient records. Military commanders from both species conducted joint training exercises and learned to work together, despite years of hatred. There were many problems and conflicts, and several times the alliance nearly fell apart. But Kate and Lyra were always there to remind everyone what was at stake. Ember became something of a symbol for the alliance, and the dragon seemed to understand her importance because she was always calm and friendly when meeting new people from either species. 3 months after the conference, the first Devourer scout vessels appeared at the edge of colonized space exactly as the predictions had warned. The joint fleet was ready and waiting, and when the Devourers attacked, they were met with coordinated fire from human and Silvari ships fighting side by side. The battle was brutal and losses were heavy on both sides, but the joint fleet managed to destroy the scout vessels and drive back the advance. Kate stood on the bridge of the flagship with Lyra beside her, and they watched as human and Silvari crews celebrated their first victory together. Admiral Bennett approached and said that this was only the beginning, and the main Devourer fleet would be far more dangerous. But she also said that for the first time since the war ended, she actually believed both species might survive. Lyra asked what would happen to her father, the Emperor, who was still broadcasting propaganda and calling for her execution. Saren reported that several Silvari worlds had already rebelled against the Emperor and were joining the alliance, and it seemed likely the Empire would collapse from within. Kate said that maybe something good could come from all this pain and loss, and maybe humans and Silvari could build something better together. She thought about her brother Daniel, and wished he could see this moment when former enemies chose cooperation over destruction. Lyra said quietly that none of this would have happened if Kate had not made space for her at that table in the mess hall. Kate smiled and said that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest consequences. Ember chirped in agreement and nuzzled both of them, and Kate realized that the dragon had become a bridge between their two species, just like Kate and Lyra had. As they stood together watching the stars, Kate felt hope for the first time since the war began. The Devourers were still coming, and the fight would be long and difficult, and many more would die before it was over. But humans and Sylvari would face it together as allies and friends, and maybe that would be enough. Kate reached over and took Lyra's hand, and the alien princess squeezed back, and they stood there in comfortable silence. Two people from different worlds who had found common ground through understanding and courage and the simple willingness to make space for each other. And in that moment, Kate knew that no matter what darkness came from the void, they would face it together and they would not give up. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is not technology or weapons, but the choice to show compassion when the world demands hatred. And that choice had saved two species from destroying each other and given them a chance to survive what came next. The story of the human commander and the alien princess who changed history would be told for generations as a reminder that bridges can be built even across the widest divides. All it takes is one person willing to pull out a chair and make space.